Now, at 1 minute after 5, late news from the WLW Communications Exchange. This is Pete Matthews. A shocked, unbelieving nation and the world are in mourning for President Kennedy. Here are the latest developments in the assassination of the president. The body of the slain chief executive is being moved early this morning to the White House, where it will lie in repose today. Late word from the White House says that the body of the president has arrived from Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. The body will lie in repose today at the White House. Last night, Dallas police formally charged 24-year-old Lee Oswald with the sniper slaying of the president in the Texas city at midday yesterday. Oswald was jailed without bond, insisting he didn't know what this is all about. Texas Governor John Connally, who was seriously wounded by one of the assassin's bullets, was reported in good condition last night following 4 hours of surgery. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy has remained close by her husband ever since he was felled by the fatal shot. She was expected to go to the White House with the body this morning. Lyndon B. Johnson, the new chief executive, will meet with former President Dwight Eisenhower this morning at 11:30 and will head a group of high-ranking dignitaries in viewing Mr. Kennedy's body. The body of the slain president will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House today from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. For the first hour, only the immediate Kennedy family will be present. President Johnson and other officials will view the body between 11 and 2 o'clock. For the rest of the day, associate justices of the Supreme Court and members of the federal judiciary will view the body from 2 until 2:30. Members of the House and Senate and governors will attend from 2:30 till 5. From 5 to 6, members of the diplomatic corps will view the body. Tomorrow and Monday, the body will lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol. The public will be able to file past the president's bier all day tomorrow, and from 9 until 10 a.m. on Monday. At 11 a.m. Monday, the body will be taken to St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, where Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston will celebrate a pontifical requiem mass. Mr. Kennedy reportedly will be buried in Boston, near the grave of his infant son, Patrick. In Dallas, District Attorney Henry Wade says officials believe they have enough evidence to convict Lee Oswald. Wade says investigators learned from Oswald's Russian-born wife that he had a rifle of the type used to kill the president. She said he had it with him the night before the assassination. Police claim Oswald was in the building from which the assassin fired the fatal bullet from the president into the president's brain. A German-made rifle, a Mauser, with a telescopic sight which fired the bullet, was found in the Texas School Book Depository building, which police say there were no fingerprints on it. Oswald was arraigned on murder charges late last night, only a few hours after paraffin tests were made on his hands to determine whether he had recently fired a rifle. Police Chief Jesse Curry said Oswald will be brought before a grand jury next week. Oswald also was accused of slaying a policeman who was pursuing him less than 4 miles away from the assassination scene. Oswald ducked into the Bovie Theater after allegedly shooting the policeman. The cashier called police saying there was a suspicious-looking man in the theater. 4 policemen charged into the theater and headed toward Oswald. The suspect pulled out a revolver, but it misfired. The officers dragged him to a police car as he fought to get away. Oswald is said to be a Marxist, and he is for Fidel Castro, apparently the head or chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. In 1959, he turned up at the American Embassy in Moscow, said he wanted to renounce his U.S. citizenship, but the Russians would not grant him Soviet citizenship. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the nation's 36th president shortly after President Kennedy's death and immediately returned to Washington to take up his new burdens. On arrival in the capital city, he issued a brief statement calling for the help of God and the American people in his presidential role. Mr. Johnson moved into a series of conferences with top aides and congressional leaders from whom he drew bipartisan pledges of support. And this morning at 11:30 Eastern Standard Time, the new president meets with former President Eisenhower who several times was consulted by President Kennedy during his 34 months in the White House. In some analysis of the news this morning, it's believed President Johnson will follow the basic foreign policy of his predecessor, President Kennedy. UPI political correspondent Stuart Hensley says the only difference that should emerge is in Mr. Johnson's manner of carrying out the basic tenets of the policy. Diplomatic officials believe the Soviet Union may soon put President Johnson to a test to find out just how he will react under renewed pressures on Berlin and other trouble spots. President Kennedy responded to such pressures by building up U.S. military strength in Europe and making it clear the United States would fight to hold its position in Berlin and elsewhere. Mr. Johnson is inheriting a strong foreign policy, one backed up by the acknowledged nuclear superiority of America. There is no indication he intends to alter the fundamental policy that achieved this position. The assassination of President Kennedy gives the 1964 political picture a different look. The president had been a sure bet to win renomination at the Democratic National Convention next year, and a heavy favorite to win re-election. In modern history, incumbent presidents normally have won second terms. The struggle in the Republican ranks for the presidential nomination already is intense, and that intensity may grow. The GOP nomination might look more attractive, at least until public surveys are made on President Johnson's popularity. The nation's 3 living former presidents expressed grief and shock over the assassination of President Kennedy. Mr. Truman received the news at his home in Independence, Missouri, saying the president's death was a tragedy. Dwight Eisenhower stood red-eyed in New York City and told newsmen the death of his successor was a despicable act. Herbert Hoover, also in New York City, said in his words, "I am shocked and grieved to learn of President Kennedy's assassination." And across the nation, politicians and the man in the street shared the sorrow felt by the former presidents. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who often opposed Mr. Kennedy's policies, called the death a profound loss to the nation and the free world, and the loss of a personal friend. Around the world, the news of President Kennedy's death has caused shock and disbelief. A shocked and horrified Queen Elizabeth is leading Britain in mourning for President Kennedy, and the bell of Westminster Abbey is slated to toll 60 times today in tribute. French President de Gaulle commented on the president, saying, "In the name of the French people, I salute this grand example and this grand memory." In Berlin, the West Germans marched in a torchlight parade, weeping for the man who 5 months ago stood before the Berlin Wall and said, "I am a Berliner." Pope Paul VI offered a special mass for the soul of President Kennedy in his private chapel at Vatican City. We have late word from Moscow that Soviet Premier Khrushchev has made his first public comment on President Kennedy's death. On returning to Moscow this morning, Khrushchev called the assassination a heavy blow to all people who hold dear the cause of peace and Soviet-American cooperation. Here's the WLW Weather Service forecast. For Cincinnati and the Ohio Valley, the rains ending this morning, windy and then turning colder today. Temperatures dropping into the 30s. By tonight, partly cloudy, windy, and much colder, with the lows reaching the mid and low 20s. Right now, it's 57 in Cincinnati, across the valley, 56 at Lexington, 58 at Louisville. Columbus, Ohio is 54 degrees. Dayton, Ohio is 57. It's 48 degrees in Indianapolis. So that's the weather and news from WLW Communications Exchange. WLW Radio has suspended its regularly scheduled programs during this time of morning for our late president. We will join the NBC network at 7:30 this morning. Now it's 11 minutes after 5 o'clock in Cincinnati.
At 4 minutes past 6 o'clock, the latest news from WLW. President Kennedy's body was moved to the White House this morning from nearby Bethesda Naval Hospital. Hundreds of persons lined the sidewalks outside the grounds of the Executive Mansion, and hundreds more were across the street to watch the slain president's final return to the White House. Black bunting was draped over the doorway through which the body passed. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy rode in the ambulance with her husband's body and followed it into the White House. 6 servicemen, representing all the armed forces, carried the flag-draped casket into the Executive Mansion. They moved in a slow procession behind an escort of 12 Marines. The casket moved past an honor guard of other military men from the portico through the lobby and a hall to the East Room. 2 Catholic priests were also present to pray through the night for the chief executive. Mr. Kennedy's body will lie in repose in the East Room for 8 hours today, beginning at 10 a.m. The first hour is set aside for the immediate Kennedy family. Between 11 o'clock and 3, President Lyndon Johnson will head a group of dignitaries who will view the body. Among those expected to be present are former President Dwight Eisenhower, House Speaker John McCormick, and Chief Justice Earl Warren. Later in the afternoon, senators, congressmen, governors, associate justices, diplomats, and other officials will view the body. Mr. Kennedy's body will lie in state tomorrow and Monday in the rotunda of the Capitol. The public will be permitted to file past the bearer all day tomorrow until 9 p.m. and from 9 until 10 o'clock Monday morning. After that, the body will be moved to St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington for final rites conducted by Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston. It's presumed that the president will be buried in the family plot in Boston. Meanwhile, Mr. Kennedy's accused slayer, Lee Oswald, is being held in Dallas without bond. The 24-year-old Castro sympathizer was booked last night on a murder charge in the assassination. Oswald is also accused of fatally shooting a policeman who was chasing him shortly before he was arrested in a Dallas movie theater. District Attorney Henry Wade says he believes investigators have enough evidence to convict Oswald. Texas Governor John Connally, who was seriously wounded by one of the assassin's bullets, was reported in good condition today. He underwent 4 hours of chest surgery yesterday afternoon. Connally had been riding in the same car with the president in a motorcade through Dallas when the assassin's shots rang out. President Lyndon Johnson, sworn in shortly after Mr. Kennedy died, spent the night in his home in suburban Washington. The new chief executive met with administration and congressional officials yesterday and received an immediate pledge of bipartisan cooperation. Farm leaders were among the hundreds of American leaders who expressed their shock at the news of President Kennedy's assassination yesterday. Among the statements, this one from Charles B. Schuman, the president of the American Farm Bureau Federation. Schuman said, quote, "The grief of farmers at the death of President Kennedy is deep and profound. Farmers, more than any, know the birth and growth of life and the hand of God that maintains it through all seasons and all adversities. It is this faith that they will turn to now in the tragedy of this hour, and a prayer for the president's family and loved ones." Another comment came from James Patton, the president of the National Farmers Union. Patton said the president's assassination leaves us stunned and grief-stricken. He went on, "John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a great president, a great world leader. He will be remembered as the friend of the family farmer." In this area, Governor and Mrs. Rhodes of Ohio will fly to Washington this morning to view the body of the assassinated president. The governor and his wife will return to Columbus this evening. They're to review the remains of the late Mr. Kennedy at the White House this afternoon. Will make the trip by commercial airline. Last night, the governor issued a proclamation calling for all national and state flags in Ohio to be flown at half-mast for a 30-day mourning period for Mr. Kennedy. Last night, Ohioans flocked to churches and synagogues in all communities for memorial services. In Kentucky, Governor Burt Combs, stunned by the news of President Kennedy's assassination, has set aside a speech that he intended to deliver at Founders Day ceremonies at Morehead State College yesterday. He told his audience instead that a critical moment in the history of the world had been reached. "The hearts of all Kentuckians go out to the bereaved family of President Kennedy," Combs said. He said it was a time for rededication to tolerance and kindness by working together. Under the most difficult conditions, the athletic directors of both the University of Kentucky and the University of Tennessee have decided to continue with plans for the scheduled game between the Wildcats and the Volunteers at Lexington today. However, school officials said that the halftime events would be restricted to the playing of the national anthem, presentation of a color guard, a prayer, and a brief address by University of Kentucky President Dr. John Oswald. In Indiana, Governor Welch learned of the slaying while he was attending the Midwest Governors Conference at Omaha, Nebraska. He called it a great tragedy of all the people of America and the world. Lieutenant Governor Richard Ristine, the top-ranking Republican, the highest-ranking state official present in Indiana when the news came, said, quote, "Everyone in the world is stunned beyond words at this terrible event." The assassination cast a pall over normal weekend activities in Indiana. Many activities were canceled or postponed. The traditional Old Oaken bucket football clash between Indiana and Purdue at Bloomington was canceled. However, most of the regularly scheduled basketball games were played last night. Religious services in memory of the murdered president began in Indiana shortly after the word of his death was received. At the University of Notre Dame, Sacred Heart Chapel was soon filled with scores of students and faculty members praying for Mr. Kennedy. They were summoned by the tolling of the chapel bell. At Valparaiso University, a Lutheran institution, 2 services were held yesterday in the nation's largest college chapel. More than 2,000 persons were on hand for the second of the 2 services. All over Cincinnati area, special services in memory of President Kennedy will be held in churches and other places of worship today. A requiem mass will be sung at St. Peter and James Cathedral in Cincinnati at noon today. The formal dedication of the new Interstate 75 bridge over the Ohio River between Cincinnati and Covington, Kentucky, has been postponed until a week from Monday night because of the president's death. The bridge itself will be open to traffic this coming Monday afternoon at 3:30 as originally scheduled. Weather forecast for this area today: cloudy, windy, and turning colder, with light rain ending in the forenoon, temperature falling into the 30s. Tonight, clearing and much colder, low in the mid-20s. Sunday, fair and cold. That's the latest news and weather from WLW. WLW Radio has suspended its regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his bereaved family, and for President Lyndon Johnson. Let us continue now with music honoring the memory of our late president, the 101 Strings, Inspiration and Meditation.
Eastern Standard Time is 7 o'clock. At this time, we'll have the latest news for you from the WLW Communications Exchange. Bill Robbins reporting.
Good morning, everyone. This is a day of grief for the nation. The nation stunned by disbelief almost, although now it's a reality. The president, the former president of the United States, John Kennedy, assassinated yesterday afternoon. The body of President Kennedy was returned to the White House for the last time this morning. A gray Navy ambulance carried the casket from Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the body was kept since yesterday afternoon. Riding in the ambulance were Mrs. Jocelyn Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy wore the same pink suit she had on in Dallas yesterday. 6 servicemen representing all the military services carried the flag-draped casket from the ambulance to the East Room of the White House, where the body will lie in repose today. Black crepe was in place along the north wall of the room, the largest in the White House. A military honor guard will remain with the casket until it is removed tomorrow to lie in state in the Capitol building. 2 priests also are present to pray for the slain chief executive. Virtually all news today is devoted to the tragic assassination of the president and the events which have taken place in connection with it. Taking time out briefly for a look at other tragic news here in Ohio. Tragedy at Norwalk, Ohio, where between 40 and 60 persons are believed to have died early this morning when flames destroyed a home for the aged south of Norwalk in Huron County. The Ohio Highway Patrol says the fire broke out at the home in Fitchville, a village of less than 500 population, about 10 miles from Norwalk. Patrolman said the home, believed the Golden Agers home, was a total loss, cause of the blaze not known. Normally, the home has a population of about 70 residents. There was no indication the identity of the victims or how many actually died in that fire. A man identified as 38-year-old Basil Matthews died in a fire early today in Cincinnati at 1810 Race Street. a careless smoker was blamed. Turning again to the millions of words which already have been printed and spoken in connection with the president's tragic assassination. In the latest developments, Dallas police have booked 24-year-old Lee Oswald on murder charges in the assassination. Oswald is jailed without bond. Investigators say he was in the building from which the assassin fired the fatal bullet, and they think they have enough evidence to convict him. Oswald, an avowed Marxist and a Castro sympathizer, is charged with the murder of a policeman who tried to apprehend him. The bullets which killed President Kennedy and seriously wounded Texas Governor John Connally were fired from a warehouse called the Texas School Book Depository. Police found the rifle with a telescopic sight, but there were no fingerprints on it. Oswald was given tests to determine whether he'd recently fired a weapon. Governor Connally was reported in good condition after undergoing 4 hours of chest surgery. President Lyndon Johnson has called in Secretary of State Dean Rusk this morning for the first of a full day of top-level meetings. The morning session comes less than 24 hours after the new chief executive was formally sworn in. Mr. Johnson confers later this morning with former President Eisenhower. President Johnson has set up office temporarily in his former vice presidential quarters in the executive office building just west of the White House. He continues to reside at his mansion just outside Washington. Mr. Johnson has set aside a few silent minutes today to lead other top-level officials in viewing the body of the president, President Kennedy. The two Kennedy children were asleep in the White House this morning when their father's body was brought in. Mrs. Kennedy is faced with the terrible task of telling them of their father's death. Today, only members of the president's family, cabinet and government leaders, Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, and members of the diplomatic corps will be allowed to view the body. The public will be able to file past the president's casket at the Capitol all day tomorrow and for 1 hour Monday morning. Final rites, with Richard Cardinal Cushing officiating, will be held at noon Monday in Washington. The president probably will be buried in Boston. All over the nation and here in Cincinnati, special services in memory of President Kennedy will be held in churches and other places of worship. A Requiem Mass will be sung at St. Peter and Chains Cathedral in Cincinnati at noon today. St. John's Unitarian Church in Clifton will hold a service tonight between 7 and 8 in tribute to the president. The formal dedication of the new I-75 bridge over the Ohio River between Cincinnati and Covington, Kentucky, has been postponed until a week from Monday night because of the president's death. The bridge itself will be open to traffic Monday afternoon at 3:30 as originally scheduled. So far as the rest of the nation is concerned, it seems that cancellations, postponements, and closings are the order of the day for millions of Americans who halted their normal weekend activities to honor their president. President Kennedy allowed to watch the Harvard-Yale football clash that would have been played today. It was canceled, so were scores of other college football games. The lights of Broadway were dimmed last night. Broadway theaters and musical events closed. The Copacabana nightclub and others shut their doors. New Yorkers with the thousands entered St. Patrick's Cathedral to pray for the slain president. Governor and Mrs. Rhodes of Ohio will fly to Washington this morning to view the body of assassinated President Kennedy. The governor and his wife return to Columbus this evening. They will view the remains of the late Mr. Kennedy at the White House this afternoon. Last night, the governor issued a proclamation calling for all national and state flags in Ohio to be flown at half-mast for a 30-day mourning period for Mr. Kennedy. Governor Combs of Kentucky, stunned by the news of President Kennedy's assassination, set aside a speech he had intended to deliver at Founders' Day ceremonies at Morehead State College yesterday. He told his audience instead that a critical moment in the history of the world has been reached. He said the hearts of all Kentuckians go out to the bereaved family of President Kennedy. Within moments of the president's death, flags dropped to half-staff at the state capitol in Frankfort, Kentucky, and elsewhere throughout the Commonwealth. Stunned Hoosiers from all walks of life mourn for the assassinated President Kennedy. From Governor Welch to the man in the street, the people of Indiana were stunned by the news that the president had been shot to death in Dallas. Governor Welch learned of the slaying while attending the Midwest Governors Conference at Omaha, Nebraska, and he called it a great tragedy for all of the people of America and the world. All state offices in Indiana were closed at mid-afternoon yesterday. Flags ordered placed at half-staff in Indiana for 30 days. Major General John Anderson, the state adjutant general, said under a previously prepared plan for any type of emergency, security measures immediately were tightened at all Indiana state military installations. The family of assassinated President Kennedy asked last night that anyone wishing to send flowers to the White House or to the funeral instead donate to charity an equivalent amount of money. In Moscow, Premier Khrushchev expressed sympathy to the American people after hearing about President Kennedy's assassination. Khrushchev said the Soviet people shared the deep grief of American citizens for Mr. Kennedy. He said he had a realistic and broad outlook on international problems. Khrushchev said the base crime evokes indignation in his people. The premier had rushed back to Moscow from the Ukraine on hearing of the tragic event. Khrushchev, accompanied by Foreign Secretary Gromyko, drove to the home of U.S. Ambassador Floyd Kohler in the morning rain. Kohler solemnly shook hands with them and led them to a booth where a photograph of President Kennedy lay on a table next to a loose-leaf book. Khrushchev signed the book without speaking, stepped aside, and Gromyko signed. In the United Nations, the Cuban ambassador said his nation received the news of President Kennedy's assassination with profound displeasure. At London, a monitored broadcast by the New China News Agency in Peking reported the shooting of Mr. Kennedy, but made no other comment. President Johnson has inherited leadership of the Democratic Party today, along with vast power to shape it for victory or defeat in 1964. The death of President Kennedy so scrambled the political outlook, it'll be months before solid assessments can be made of prospects in the coming presidential election year. At first glance, the change in Democrats in the White House seemed to hurt more than help Senator Goldwater of Arizona. Kennedy had been certain to win renomination and was heavily favored to win re-election because of the built-in advantages of an incumbent president. Inasmuch as Johnson wanted the presidential nomination in 1960, he probably will want it again next August when the Democratic National Convention meets at Atlantic City. In a few days, politicians will be asking how will the shift in the White House affect Republican family warfare over the choice of a Republican nominee next July. And will the policies of Johnson, who is classed as more moderate than the late President Kennedy, provoke a revolt aimed at nominating a more liberal Democratic candidate for the presidency? In any case, President Johnson was certain today to give his driving support to the embattled Kennedy legislative program. Congressional leaders, stunned by President Kennedy's assassination, confessed they might not know the force of Johnson's backing until January. All said it was too early to forecast legislative events. There were no immediate indications that Kennedy's tragic death would break any legislative deadlocks. Congress, it appeared, may start its Christmas recess a week early, but solution to the tax and civil rights problems will await the new president's State of the Union and budget messages next January. Democratic and Republican congressional leaders pledged their personal cooperation to Johnson almost immediately after his return to Washington. But the pledge was not given in terms of legislative objectives as much as in terms of backing in his personal crisis and the continuing fight for world freedom. An acknowledged master in the legislative art, Johnson's years of experience and leadership in Congress were expected to count for much in the months ahead. Senate Democratic Whip Hubert Humphrey said, "We are fortunate that President Johnson is experienced and able as he is." Johnson has been out in front of many administration leaders in urging action of the Kennedy administration's civil rights, tax cut, and space programs, all of which now are under heavy fire. Still awaiting congressional action before the mid-December recess, which will end legislative work for this year, are 8 money bills and 2 major education measures, most of them backed by the late president. Leaders have been counting on disposing of these at least before quitting for 1963. After their 20-minute meeting with the new president, the bipartisan group of leaders agreed to a joint statement of their personal cooperation and friendship, and then slipped away to their homes and offices to recover from the afternoon's shocking event. We've been telling you about cancellations of various events as a result of the tragic assassination of the president. The Ohio State Buckeyes clash with Michigan will be held at Ann Arbor, the game clouded, though, by the horrors of the president's assassination. Now, the smallest crowd in 20 years is expected to attend the traditional game. Sporting events all over the nation were sharply curtailed as a result of the president's death. Among contests not postponed or canceled were 2 which have a direct bearing on conference championships and New Year's Day bowl invitations. Illinois will tangle with Michigan State for the Big Ten crown and a trip to the Rose Bowl, while the other contest pits Oklahoma against Nebraska for the Big 8 championship and an Orange Bowl bid. Other games still scheduled to be played are, as we mentioned, the Michigan-Ohio State game and the Kentucky-Tennessee game. In the American Football League, an announcement was made last night. 4 games slated for Sunday have been postponed and will be rescheduled. Under the most difficult conditions, athletic directors of both the University of Kentucky and the University of Tennessee decided to continue with their plans for that scheduled game today at Lexington. Over in Indiana, the traditional Old Oak and Bucket football clash between Indiana and Purdue at Bloomington was canceled. 3 of the National Basketball Association's 4 games scheduled for tonight are expected to be played. All NBA action last night was canceled because of the death of President Kennedy. The Cincinnati Royals are scheduled to play at St. Louis. In college football, the University of Cincinnati-Miami game will be played at 2 o'clock at Nippert Stadium here in Cincinnati today. That decision made after lengthy discussions between school officials following the assassination of President Kennedy. And Xavier's Musketeers are scheduled to play Bowling Green's Falcons at Bowling Green, Ohio, this afternoon. Another story from Cincinnati. 83-year-old Louis Dahman of 3405 Telford Avenue in Clifton was fatally injured last night when he was hit by an automobile at Clifton and Hosea Avenues. Mr. Dahman had retired 11 years ago after 43 years with the Cincinnati Waterworks. Again, repeating that all over the Cincinnati area and around the nation, special services in memory of President Kennedy are being held in churches and other places of worship. A Requiem Mass will be sung at St. Peter and Chains Cathedral here in Cincinnati at noon today. And a reminder to motorists that the formal dedication of the new I-75 bridge over the Ohio River between Cincinnati and Covington, Kentucky, has been postponed until a week from Monday night because of the President's death. The bridge itself will be open to traffic Monday afternoon at 3:30 as originally scheduled. WLW Radio joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow at the death of President Kennedy.
The weather forecast for the tri-state area today: cloudy, windy, and turning colder with light rain ending in the forenoon. Temperatures falling into the 30s. Clearing and much colder tonight, lows in the mid-20s. Sunday's weather, fair and cold. The present temperature in Cincinnati, 53 degrees. That's the latest news from WLW's Communications Exchange. Bill Robbins reporting. WLW has suspended its regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President, John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his bereaved family, and President Lyndon Johnson. 15 minutes after 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, we are expecting to rejoin the National Broadcasting Company coverage at 7:30 this morning. In the meantime, we'll continue with recorded music. This is the nation station, WLW in Cincinnati. Due to special programming on the assassination of President Kennedy, the Signal 3 and Midwestern Hayride television programs will not be telecast today. Audiences planning to attend these programs are asked not to come to the WLW television studios for these programs today. Eastern Standard Time is 7:30. We now join the NBC Radio Network.
This is NBC News, beginning its continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of President Kennedy. Now here is Russ Ward, NBC News.
The body of President John F. Kennedy during the early hours of this morning was returned to the White House for the last time. The body will lie in repose throughout the day while close friends and high government officials pay their respects. In Dallas, Texas, a 24-year-old man who has professed his love for Russia and has many times in the past denounced capitalism has been charged with murder in the president's assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald, held without bail, proclaims his innocence. Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade says there is no one else but him. Around the world, the reaction is universal. Shock at the act of murder, sorrow for the president's family. Soviet Premier Khrushchev went to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow to personally pay his condolences. Pope Paul VI proclaimed, "We deplore this event with all our heart." UN Secretary General U Thant expressed profound sorrow at this most tragic event. Now for the full story in detail. First, we go to NBC's Richard Valeriani in Washington.
The late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy came back to the White House for the last time early today, borne in a bronze casket draped with an American flag. A light gray Navy hearse bearing the casket rolled slowly through the Pennsylvania Avenue entrance and pulled up to the front door of the Executive Mansion just before 4:30. About 500 mourners stood outside the gate and watched in silence in the chill morning air. Preceding the hearse, a 13-man Marine honor guard, their bayonets glinting in the glare of camera lights, marched with sorrowful step along the drive which curves around the White House lawn. Flames from 12 smudge pots flickered along the driveway. The president's widow, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, sat in the hearse beside the casket on the 25-minute drive from Bethesda Naval Hospital. Mrs. Kennedy rode with her arms stretched across the coffin. She was wearing the same pink suit that was spattered with blood when the president was shot. As she stepped from the hearse, she seemed to stumble. The Attorney General took her arm, and they followed as an honor guard representing all 4 military services carried the casket into the White House. Black bunting hung around the door in stark contrast to the white facade of the Executive Mansion. The casket, mounted on a catafalque and flanked by 2 burning candles, will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House during the day for viewing by members of the family, President Lyndon Johnson, and other high officials of the government and foreign diplomats. Above the White House, the American flag flies at half-mast. Richard Valeriani, NBC News, at the White House in Washington.
The new president, 55-year-old Lyndon Johnson, is scheduled to hold a late morning conference with Dwight Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States. Also on Mr. Johnson's calling list this morning, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, presumably for a talk on the problems that confront the nation around the world. At mid-afternoon, Mr. Johnson is to meet with his cabinet. On arrival in Washington last night from Dallas, the scene of the tragedy, President Johnson told the American people, "I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's." He then held an immediate conference with several of his cabinet members and with congressional leaders of both parties. The word went out that these leaders had given him hearty assurances of bipartisan support. Only a few hours before, Mr. Johnson had taken the presidential oath in a jet plane standing on a Dallas runway, ready to depart for Washington. The ceremony witnessed by the newly widowed Jacqueline Kennedy, her clothing still stained from her husband's blood. Less than 12 hours after Mr. Kennedy was cut down in his ceremonial limousine by rifle bullets from a sniper, charges were filed against 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, who had professed love for Russia and once tried to renounce his American citizenship. District Attorney Henry Wade of Dallas, Texas, was asked if authorities were still looking for anyone else in connection with the murder. Said Wade, "There is no one else but him." Taken before microphones and cameras during the early hours of this morning, Oswald managed an occasional smile as he insisted in a low voice that he was innocent of the death of Mr. Kennedy. Earlier, he had declared, "I did not kill the president. I did not kill anyone." Wade was asked if he regarded Oswald as communist-inspired or just a nut, and he put it this way, "Well, I don't think he's a nut. I think he is sane." Oswald had been taken into custody soon after Mr. Kennedy was fatally shot, and shortly after Texas Governor John Connally wounded by 3 volleys fired from the high-powered rifle. In Brookline, Massachusetts, a monument 4 feet high and 7 feet long rests on a gentle knoll in Hollywood Cemetery. The word Kennedy carved across the front of the white granite slab. Off slightly to one side is a small marker. It reads Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. The site is the family plot where President Kennedy probably will be buried beside his infant son, who died August 9th, 2 days after birth. Police are maintaining a 24-hour watch to protect the plot from the curious and from the sympathetic. Tragedy, no stranger to the Kennedy family. 3 of the 9 children born to the former U.S. Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy and his wife, Rose, now are dead. 1 murdered, 2 in plane crashes. The 4th, a lifelong patient in a mental hospital. Joseph Kennedy, the 74-year-old multimillionaire father, suffered a crippling stroke in December of 1961. Confined to a wheelchair, he has around-the-clock nurses and can say only one word clearly, that word, no. A late report now from Dallas, Texas, the scene of the assassination. Pierce Allman, station WFAA in Dallas.
Lee Harvey Oswald, charged with murdering the President of the United States and a Dallas policeman, defected to Russia in 1959. In 1962, he returned to the United States, and in August this year, he passed out pro-Castro leaflets on a New Orleans street. On September 26th, President Kennedy announced plans for a trip to Dallas. A few days later, Oswald got a job in the Texas School Book Depository building overlooking the motorcade route. On October 14th, he rented a room in Dallas, and yesterday was seen by R.S. Truly, the building superintendent, and a Dallas policeman in the book firm building just after a barrage of shots from the 6th floor struck the president and Governor John Conway. O.V. Campbell, the vice president of the firm, said he and Truly, the superintendent, ran toward a grassy knoll west of the building where he thought the sniper had hidden. In a storage room on the first floor, a police officer, gun drawn, spotted Oswald and asked the superintendent, "Does this man work here?" Truly, who said he had interviewed and hired Oswald a couple of months earlier, reportedly told the policeman at that time that Oswald was a worker. The policeman and Truly continued their search of the building, and Lee Harvey Oswald strolled out the front door. He later failed to report at a 1:15 p.m. roll call of employees, and Truly reported this to police. When the assassin was dragged from the darkened Texas Theater in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas yesterday afternoon, he was screaming, "I protest this police brutality." And a crowd of several hundred citizens were pressing forward chanting, "Kill him! Kill him!" And had not officers moved quickly and with authority, 24-year-old Lee H. Oswald might have suffered a worse fate than the world leader he suspected of killing. Governor John Conway is in satisfactory condition this morning, though he is under heavy sedation. He has not yet been told of the fate of the President of the United States. And ironically enough, it was luck that saved the governor's life, for after hearing the first shot, had he not turned his head, the bullet from the sniper would have entered his heart. This is Piers Allman, WFAA Dallas, for NBC News.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We now pause 10 seconds for station identification.
This is WLW Cincinnati.
For late developments now from the capital city, Robert McCormick, NBC News, Washington.
Well, Washington faces a leaden and a bitter day. Never has this city been shaken any more badly than it has been by the developments of the last 24 hours. It has now the unhappy job of making sure the government gets back into high gear, for it must go on no matter what happens. President Johnson will, of course, have a series of conferences at the White House today with his leaders, and determinations will be made on what programs should be held up until he can review them, what programs should be pursued with the same speed they have been in the past. The whole country, of course, has a respect for the presidency, but in Washington it naturally is especially strong. The job is almost revered. The person can be criticized, but his position is always respected. And in this case, people in Washington feel that they've not only lost a beloved person, but they have as well watched the position suffer a ghastly indignity.
I wanted to get some reaction from you, Robert, on the city of Washington. Of course, government offices are closed today. It's my understanding they did close early yesterday. Is that correct?
Yes, they did, producing a monumental traffic jam. I don't say that in a facetious way at all, but largely because as the drivers heading out into Virginia and Maryland passed the White House, they sort of involuntarily slowed down, not to stare as tourists really, but just sort of in an involuntary gesture of respect. And I think I see my good friend Hubert Humphrey coming in here now, Rust, and we'd like to talk to him if we can. Good morning. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
Senator, I'm very happy indeed to see you, and I was with you yesterday for a while. I know how deeply this has affected you. Would you mind telling us something of your ideas now, either on what has happened or what will happen? I should explain Senator Humphrey is the Democratic whip of the Senate, works under Senator Mike Mansfield, the Democratic leader.
Well, Bob, that I'm still somewhat in a state of confusion and of such deep concern and shock that I haven't been able to really get myself functioning like I would like to. This is a real fact, and one that's very troublesome. I was at the, Mrs. Humphrey and I should say, were at the Chilean embassy yesterday for a luncheon. By the way, I don't believe I've accepted one lunch in years to be away from the capital at noontime, but the Chilean ambassador is a very kind and gracious man, and he'd been to my home state of Minnesota, and I thought I ought to reciprocate and at least accept an invitation, and I was there with Ralph Dungan and others at Mr. Dungan being the late President Kennedy's assistant. And the news came to us that the president had been shot, at that time wounded, and of course, like others, we hoped and prayed that the wound wasn't as serious as the first news reports indicated. Then, of course, I received a telephone call from the White House, and I was told that the president had passed away, that he'd been killed. I then, all at once, it dawned on me that the closeness of relationship, this is something that I've been reflecting upon. I'd worked with President Kennedy, and I'd been a colleague of his in the Senate, and as we all know, I'd been a contestant with him in the primaries, and then I became a lieutenant of the president's in the legislative program, and I worked very closely with him and had a very friendly and warm personal relationship. But when that news came that he had been taken from us, that he'd been shot, I stood alone in the hallway of the embassy, and I'm not ashamed to say I just couldn't contain myself. I just broke down and sobbed because it seemed like a bit of life had gone right out of me. And then to try to tell others to come to the table and to tell the guests and the host that we'd lost our president was a very, very difficult assignment. And so during that day of yesterday and this morning, it all seems like, it just seems like it's not reality. I keep hoping that somehow or another that this is one of those moments that just isn't true, that it's unreal, that it's an ugly dream. But of course it is real. We have to face up to it. Mrs. Humphrey and I were at the airport at Andrews Air Base last night when the president's body was brought back. I still see my old friend and the president's intimate personal friend, Dave Powers, there with his beloved friend, President Kennedy, and Larry O'Brien, Kenny O'Donnell, these wonderful men that worked with President Kennedy. And they were there with him to the very last moment. They were there as they tenderly and lovingly brought his body back to the nation's capital. And then I saw Mrs. Humphrey and I saw Mrs. Kennedy. That poor lady, what she has gone through, losing her baby, and now her husband, and yet the strength and the poise that she demonstrates is an inspiration to all of us. I haven't had a chance to see her yet. Mrs. Humphrey hasn't. But I know that she realizes, knows that we really are with her in spirit and in prayer and in sympathy. So we later on during the night moved to see the new president, President Johnson. I want to say a word about that, Bob. Is it all right just to
very much
go on and talk to you about it?
Yes.
All during my service in the Senate, I've been a close friend of President Lyndon Johnson. You know, it's very difficult to change terminology because I've always thought of President Johnson as Lyndon. But now it's President Johnson. And I know of his sterling qualities of leadership and his unique ability to perform the art of politics. He really is a competent tactician, a leader, born leader. He loves public service. But I want to say one other thing about him. I watched him as the companion and the supporting arm of President Kennedy, our late and beloved President Kennedy, and he was intensely loyal to President Kennedy. Even when there were little things said that could appear to divide them, he never let that happen, nor did President Kennedy let that happen. I was with them morning after morning at breakfast, as you know. Every Tuesday morning we'd have breakfast at the White House. I sat right next to President Johnson as the vice president then, and right across the table from the president. I know the exchanges that took place. I've kept little notes of this. And the warmth of feeling, the friendliness that was there, and the give and the take, the good humor, and yet also the seriousness of purpose. I was there, I know, you see. I literally rubbed arms with the vice president, now the president, and looked right into the eyes of the president right across the table, President Kennedy. And I want to say now, so that there can never be any doubt about it, that the loyalty, the faithfulness to the man that Vice President Johnson at that time had to President Kennedy was beyond doubt. It was marvelous. He was dedicated to him. And the Vice President was dedicated to President Kennedy's program, and he will continue to be. I happen to know that he will consider one of the memorials that we can leave or can give to President Kennedy is the fulfillment of President Kennedy's program, because this is the living memorial. I watched Vice President Johnson, as Vice President, I should say, go to great limits, almost beyond his strength, to fulfill tasks for President Kennedy then. So this spirit of understanding and friendship must be clearly understood in the American public, and I think it is. And I want our friends overseas to know, too, that in President Johnson, you have one who worked alongside of President Kennedy. You have one that is dedicated to the same program, to the same international commitments, to the love of this republic, to the love of freedom, political freedom, all the freedoms. And I must say that while our forefathers had such foresight in giving us a political system where there can be a transfer of power without the contest for power, without a struggle for power, where we have political institutions that can endure almost any kind of pain and crisis, that God Almighty has been very good to us too. We have men that are trained for these jobs. And in America, with Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States now, we have a man that is trained for the job, that is an experienced leader, that is dedicated to political life and to the principles of democracy. We're fortunate, very, very fortunate.
Thank you very much, Senator, and perhaps you'd like to stay for just a moment, because I'm going to switch to Peter Hackus out at President Johnson's home, Les Ormes. Peter, are you there?
President Lyndon Johnson has just left his home here in northwest Washington on a 10 or 12-minute ride downtown to the executive office building. There were 3 cars. The first one was the Secret Service car called affectionately the Queen Mary. Then came the President's car. He was seated in the rear seat on the right next to the window. As I saw him when he pulled out of the driveway, his face was drawn in a rather determined look. There were a number of other officials inside the car. Behind that was another Secret Service car, and the entire 3-car motorcade was surrounded by 6 or 7 Washington, D.C. motorcycle policemen. The crowd outside the home of Mr. Johnson thinned out for a while when it started to drizzle. Then the rain stopped, and I would say there were about 50 people here when he left this morning. He's on his way now down to his usual office in the executive office building, which is located directly next door to the White House. His first meeting today will be with Secretary of State Rusk for breakfast. Later on this morning, President Johnson and his family and some top officials of the new Johnson government are expected to view the body of the late President Kennedy as it lies in repose in the East Room of the White House. Johnson has asked the full Kennedy cabinet to stay on. So as of this moment, Lyndon Baines Johnson has left his home for his first day of duty as the nation's 36th president. This is Peter Hackus, NBC News, outside the Johnson home in Washington.
As the city of Washington and the rest of the nation and the world mourn the death of John F. Kennedy, the city of Dallas, Texas, keeps a close eye on what is regarded as the man responsible for the assassination of the president, a 24-year-old who has been charged with murder but who professes his innocence. More on this phase of the story now as we go to Pierce Allman, station WFAA in Dallas.
Lee Oswald, this morning, is still in Dallas County Jail, being held without bond. He still protests his innocence, although District Attorney Henry Wade says he has enough conclusive evidence to ask for capital punishment in the event he is found guilty when he's tried here in Texas in criminal district court. Governor John Conley, Russ, is in Parkland Hospital this morning. He's under heavy sedation. He lapses in and out of consciousness and asks for the Texas Department of Public Safety. Some friends have been at the governor's bedside and have told him that he himself is in pretty good shape now. They have not yet told him of the fate of President Kennedy. Actually, it was sheer luck that Conley escaped. This man was a marksman, evidently, because if Conley had not turned, why, he would have been shot in the heart instead of through the back. The town is incensed this morning, but still stunned. Everyone says the same 4 words over and over, and most say it with the same tone. It's this blank look, and I can't believe it.
Pierce, can you tell us if Governor Conley is aware of the death of the president?
No, he's not, Russ. He hasn't been told of the death of the president yet. He has been under sedation. And an interesting note, we learned from Washington a few moments ago that Republican Representative Alger and Republican Senator John Tower, moments after the death notice of Mr. Kennedy yesterday afternoon, began receiving highly abusive telephone calls and decided to go to the homes of friends temporarily. And the superintendent of Parkland Hospital this morning said that no extra precautions were being taken, no extra security measures for Governor Conley at Parkland. He said, "We have no fear for the governor's life."
We now pause 10 seconds for station identification.
WLW, Cincinnati. WLW Radio and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join our listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president.
Been an important development at Dallas Police Headquarters. For that story, to Tom Pettit in Dallas.
The chief of the Dallas Police Force, J.E. Curry, has just reported to us that the paraffin test taken on the suspect, the man charged with the crime, Lee Oswald, the results of the paraffin test are positive. Now, the chief points out that what this means is that this proves that the man had fired a gun. He says it does not definitely link him to the rifle, which is suspected of being the murder weapon used in the assassination of President Kennedy. The investigation goes on. There are only partial fingerprints on the rifle, the chief says, and these cannot definitely be linked to Oswald. This crowd here is waiting to see Oswald in the event he is brought in for further interrogation. That's the situation up to this moment at Dallas Police Headquarters. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News in Dallas.
And now for another look at the situation as it develops in Washington. Back to Edwin Newman in Washington.
At this moment, former President Eisenhower is due momentarily at the White House, and we switch to Robert Goralski at the White House.
There's still no indication when former President Eisenhower will arrive. Been standing by here now, that short distance from the airport made difficult because of the rain and the traffic. Senator Everett Dirksen, the minority leader in the Senate, arrived here about 5 or 10 minutes ago. Members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, together with cabinet members, have started to file into the East Room of the White House where President Kennedy's body lies in repose. And they will remain in there for the next 55 minutes or so. But still no word that President Eisenhower, where he is at the moment, we're anticipating in any moment. There were reports that he had been inside, that he did not come in through the north portico, which might well be true, but we still have no confirmation of that. Ray Shearer, who is also at the White House, has been over to the North Portico. He's walking over here now. I think he may have something to report. Let's talk to him, Ray?
I just went up to say hello to President Eisenhower, who is in this Cadillac about 50 feet from us. He's sitting with Senator Dirksen and his military aide, General Schultz, waiting to go inside. He caught a plane from Gettysburg this morning, landed here about 10:30, and he's been waiting, as you know, about 20 minutes.
Why are they waiting out here, though, Ray?
They're waiting for President Johnson. It's a very involved thing. Quite a lot of people are assembling and going to the East Room in a kind of a procession. As you may or may not know, President Johnson came across the street about 5 minutes ago. With him were all the top leaders of Congress, both Republican and Democrat. The President and Mrs. Johnson were in the front row under an umbrella. Behind them was Speaker McCormick. There was Senator Humphrey, Senator Mansfield, Republican Senator Aiken, Carl Albert, the House Whip, Charles Halleck. They all went inside. And earlier, the Cabinet congregated in the Cabinet room and went together. There seems to be an order of protocol here in which people go to the East Room.
Well, there are about half dozen limousines lined up here now, waiting to more than that, about 10. None of the occupants have gotten out of the cars, and as you say, President Eisenhower's, and one of them I had no idea that he was there.
Yes, he's in there chatting quietly with Senator Dirksen. Occasionally you'll see the windshield roll down, the picture will snap, and the windshield will go back up again.
There we are. Mm-hmm.
Ray, have you had any information about the meeting between President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Kennedy? I understand that was to take place about half an hour ago, but since then we have heard that Mrs. Kennedy took the two Kennedy children into the East Room to view their father's casket. And we do not know whether the meeting between the Johnsons and Mrs. Kennedy has taken place. Do you?
I think it's probably taking place just now, Ed, because Mrs. Johnson, as far as I know, did not enter the White House until about 10 minutes ago. She went with her husband, the President. And you are quite right that earlier Mrs. Kennedy and the two children did go to the East Room. So I suppose if there is a meeting, it is to be now.
We are told, Ray, that Mrs. Kennedy was heavily veiled, but did not appear to be weeping. The two children were not crying, but they were clinging to their mother. Is that the same information?
That is the same information that I have, Ed. I didn't see that happen. I've been out in the East Room watching all the cabinet members arrive. Among other people, we talked to Secretary Celebrezzi. We talked to Secretary Hodges, who was on his way to Japan, turned around and came back. They told us that as yet they have not been asked to stay on, but there is a cabinet meeting at 2:30 this afternoon in Mr. Johnson's office in the Executive Office building across the street, and presumably that will occur then.
I think Persistent Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff last night said that the purpose of the cabinet meeting at this time was for President Johnson to ask the members of the cabinet to stay on. It's a pro forma meeting at this point.
Ray, is it your impression that former President Eisenhower will be one of a group going through the East Room? Do you have...
Yes, I think he will be one of a group. If you'd like, suppose I go out and ask him and come back and tell you how it's going to go.
Please do, Ray.
All right.
Ray, while you're over there, we'll try getting this microphone cord as far over as we could. I don't know if we have enough at this point. But there are about now a dozen limousines lined up. They just moved in from Executive Avenue. Nobody is moving out of them. It's raining very, very hard right now. We're going to try moving this microphone out of it. The rain has been falling extremely hard at the moment. After an overcast morning, it really broke through about an hour and a half ago, and everybody is getting extremely wet. So those who did arrive in the limousines are staying in there to get maximum protection. NBC News correspondent Ray Shearer has just moved up to the limousine, is now talking to former President Eisenhower. The window is rolled down. With him is other NBC News correspondent Richard Valeriani. And now the limousine is moving out, the one with President Eisenhower, and is moving to the North Portico of the White House. Here's Ray. What did the President say?
Well, Mr. Eisenhower told me we're in the hands of the man at the gate. He's the commanding officer's procession, and just as I talked to him, in they went. So they're now, as you can see, the car just going under the procession. He said he would go in individually. Mr. Dirksen, I presume, will be with him.
Mr. Dirksen is in the limousine almost directly behind former President Eisenhower's. Now, Mr. Eisenhower's limousine is under the north portico. He is still in the car. Now the chauffeur comes out, comes around to the back. The door is opening, and there is
Mr. Eisenhower's
Mr. Eisenhower.
out. The blue Homburg behind him, hatless, gray hair, Senator Dirksen. And there's Mr. Eisenhower's longtime Army aide, General Bob Schultz. They're going inside.
The other cars haven't moved up as yet. We presume that there are other members of the Congress here in this now stalled motorcade, waiting for protocol reasons until former President Eisenhower.
The first car I recognize Undersecretary of the Treasury Fowler. And these, I think, are various sub-cabinet officials of sub-cabinet rank. Not the secretaries, they're inside, but next in line.
Bob and Ray, Bob, I have the text of a message that has been sent by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to all military commands. This message officially informs all military commands of the death of the President. And it says, "The world has lost a gallant spirit whose championship of freedom and opportunity will be recognized by history. All members of the armed forces, whose welfare was his constant concern, can pay no better tribute to his memory than to carry on the tradition which he shared and of which he was so proud. Colors shall be displayed at half-mast for 30 days beginning November 22nd. That is the message sent by Secretary of Defense McNamara to all military commands, informing them of the death of the President, President Kennedy, and instructing them to display colors at half-mast for 30 days. In addition to that, during the 30-day period of national mourning, all official entertainment will be canceled by the services."
Down in Atlanta, Ray Moore of WSB has been speaking to Negro leader Martin Luther King. Ray's first question was, what effect do you think the death of the president will have on the Negro population?
Well, I'm not at all a political analyst, but there are those who contend that the Negro vote had a great deal to do with President Kennedy being elected, and that many Negroes were influenced to vote for the president because of a call that he made to my wife during an arrest here in Georgia. Now, if this had anything to do with it, I certainly don't regret it, because I think President Kennedy made a most significant contribution in civil rights, and while he may not have done all that some feel that he should have done, I would be the first to say that President Kennedy came forth with the most comprehensive civil rights bill that we have ever had from any president, and he had a great understanding of the depths and dimensions of the problem, and I really feel that he was a friend to the cause of civil rights, and he created a climate of civil rights concern in Washington and in the nation.
You have had attempts made on your life and have been threatened, perhaps even tonight. What is it like to walk under this constant threat?
Well, it's often difficult, but when you live with it so long, you almost become immune to being afraid as a result of these threats. I guess you have to come to the point of looking at these things philosophically, and this is where I have decided to stand. I believe firmly that this cause is right, and that someone must have the courage and the fortitude to stand up for it, even if it means suffering or even if it means death. And I have always felt that unmerited suffering is redemptive, and even if I have to die for this cause, if physical death is a price that others will have to pay, then it is a price that is paid to free the soul of our nation and to free our children from a permanent spiritual death. And in this sense, I think it is very redemptive, or it can be, even if it occurs.
This is Ray Moore in Atlanta.
John Rich reports from Tokyo that the hammer and sickle flag flew at half-mast today, over the Soviet embassy in Tokyo in honor of President Kennedy. And this unusual sight somehow didn't seem at all out of place to the Americans there, who have now gone through a full day, one that started at dawn in shock and disbelief and ended in mourning. In the late afternoon, the memorial services were held at American military installations throughout Asia. Servicemen in Japan and Okinawa and dugouts along the truce line in Korea knelt in prayers for their former commander-in-chief. The Asians, among whom these thousands of Americans live, made touching efforts to share the Americans' grief. Americans have been stopped on the street by Japanese wanting to express their regrets. And in Tokyo, 5 Russian men came up to an American girl and told her how sorry they felt. No other news has been in the papers, nothing else carried on radio or television, except the death of President Kennedy.
NBC News correspondent Nancy Dickerson is stationed in Lafayette Park across from the White House. Now to Nancy Dickerson.
It's only right that it rains in Washington today because the pall that has already settled over the city is so bad that nothing could be much worse. There are several lines of people across the street from the White House. They're holding umbrellas, and they, too, are drenched. They're not saying much. They're just holding a faithful vigil. There are really 2 centers of activity here as you stand and watch across the street from the White House. One is in President Johnson's office. His old office is the Vice President in the Executive Office building. Now, the other one is in the White House, centering around the Press Secretary's office. And the activity goes back and forth between these 2 places. For the time being, President Johnson's office is deferring to the White House operation, and all official acknowledgments are coming from there. Mr. Johnson's office is a very, very busy place. The phones are ringing constantly. Secret Service are preventing most people from trying to get up there. Interesting thing about Mr. Johnson's telephone situation is that he always believed that even the Vice President of the United States should have his private personal telephone number listed in the telephone book. He has always adhered to that until last night when you called the Johnson home. An operator came in and said all those calls are being referred to the White House. That number is National 81414. So for the first time since he's been in public office, President Johnson does not have his private phone listed in the telephone. Well, as is well known, the speech that President Kennedy was to deliver in Dallas yesterday concerned in part the TFX fighter plane. Just before Mr. Kennedy, left for Dallas, he had called Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick, who for a few days had been under fire by a somewhat hostile committee on Capitol Hill concerning the TFX fighter plane. Mr. Kennedy called to congratulate Gilpatrick and said he had done well and said, don't be concerned about the criticism. After all, said Mr. Kennedy, I've been criticized a lot too. This is Nancy Dickerson of NBC News at Lafayette Park across the street from the White House in Washington.
President Johnson is now conferring with former President Eisenhower. President Johnson and the general arrived just a few minutes ago in a limousine, followed closely by the Black Maria, the Secret Service car, and by Mrs. Lady Bird Johnson, and went right up to the president's offices in the Executive Office building across the street here from the White House. While I was waiting for them to enter, I noted that workers have begun to remove the personal effects from the office in the White House of the late President John Kennedy. If you're looking for symbolism, one of the effects that was brought out was a model ship, as though transferring the ship of state from the late president to the new president. NBC correspondent Robert Gorowski chatted briefly with the Republican minority leader in the House of Representatives just before the meeting, Charles Halleck of Indiana. Mr. Halleck said that President Johnson appears to be showing already the awesome burden of responsibility that he has undertaken, but in Mr. Halleck's word, he seems to be bearing up very well. That's about the story from here. This is Richard Valeriani, NBC News at the White House.
Well, one thing you could always expect as a newsman was that John Fitzgerald Kennedy would be kind and courteous. I remember, Bill, that in 1960 I traveled with the then candidate for the presidency in Michigan for a brief time. and a part of that appearance was at a big Michigan State Fair just outside of Detroit. He had to travel from Detroit all the way out to Ann Arbor in an open motorcade, and all along the route there were thousands of Michiganders lining the way, and the president, with his usual, at that time again the candidate, with his usual thoughtfulness for others, insisted on riding in an open car so that everyone could get a good view of him. He sat up on the back of this convertible, sat up actually on the top of the car, and rode along at a pretty good clip. It seemed like we were going about 45 miles an hour for part of that time, trying to make up a schedule which was running behind. And then he indicated he wanted to stop. We pulled into a gasoline station. He wanted to get a Coca-Cola. So we all got out of our car, were traveling behind him. He popped for Coca-Cola for all of us and said, "I hope you're not as uncomfortable as I am riding up on the back of that car." A man that you could have in close personal contact with under almost any circumstances. We've just had word, the Mexican border was closed, and we have now word that the Mexican border has been reopened. We're going to get the story from Barry Simmons at KOGO in San Diego, California.
At 12:20 this afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, the Mexican border was reopened some 20 hours after it was closed. The closing of the border was a joint effort by both the Mexican and U.S. governments to prevent the escape into Mexico of any person or persons involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. The closure caused numerous frustrations, irritations, and tears by people who were unable to cross over into Mexico or over into the U.S. back to their homes and families. But now traffic on foot and by car is moving freely once again. Barry Simmons, San Diego.
For more than 2 weeks, the Secret Service agents worked very quietly in the city of Dallas to prevent the very thing that happened, the assassination of the president. They inspected the site for President Kennedy's speech. They surveyed the route of his motorcade. They questioned individuals whom they knew the president would come into contact with. They kept a log on known troublemakers in the Dallas area, checking their whereabouts and their habits. At first, the Secret Service vetoed the site of President Kennedy's speech, the Dallas Trade Mart, on the ground that it had too many balconies which could hide a sniper. They finally relented, but only after making sure that all 14 entrances were covered and all persons coming and going could be watched. They supervised the selection of the menu, then they supervised the preparation of the food, and made sure that the president received no different food from all the other guests. They made sure that all points along the route of the president's motorcade were amply staffed. Congested intersections and places where crowds had gathered had an extra complement of police. They even enlisted 350 policemen from the Dallas Police Force and the Dallas County Sheriff's Office to help on the day. And in spite of all that precaution, it was to no avail. And staff physicians at Parkland Hospital in Dallas and the University of Texas Southwest Medical School, who attended the fatally wounded president, all agreed today that the late president never knew what hit him. He was dead for all practical purposes when he arrived in the emergency room, said Dr. Malcolm Perry, one of the surgeons and specialists who were with the late president in the fading moments of his life. Mr. Kennedy was rolled into Parkland Hospital emergency room within 5 minutes after the sniper's bullet pierced the midsection of the front part of his neck and emerged from the top of his skull. The severity of the wound made it instantly noticeable that it was mortal, Dr. Perry said. He never had a chance. I guess we worked on him about 20 minutes. I couldn't tell how long. We were working so frantically, and after a while, Dr. M.T. Jenkins turned to me and said, "It's too late, Mac." That's the report from Dr. Malcolm Perry, one of the surgeons and specialists who were with the late president in the fading moments of his life at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. We have word from Moscow that Soviet television, in its first Telstar communications satellite broadcast, showed President Kennedy's coffin returning to Washington today. And it's interesting that in the early hours this morning, that television report, was fed from NBC headquarters here in New York, carried by Telstar overseas, and then shown in Moscow this morning. John Fitzgerald Kennedy is the fourth American president to be killed by assassin's bullets. The first, as Bryson Rash mentioned from Washington, was Abraham Lincoln, who was shot in the head on April the 15th, 1865, by Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater in Washington. James A. Garfield was gunned down on the 2nd of July in 1881 by Charles J. Guiteau in the Capitol Railroad Station as he was setting out on a vacation. President Garfield lingered on for more than 2 months before dying on the 19th of September. William McKinley died September the 14th, 1901, shot by an anarchist 8 days earlier at a Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Mr. Kennedy, of course, was fatally wounded yesterday by a sniper during the Dallas, Texas motorcade. There have been other attempts on the lives of President. Of the last 4 United States chief executives, only Dwight D. Eisenhower was not subject to an assassination attempt. Franklin D. Roosevelt was shot at down in Miami on the 15th of February, 1933, by Joseph Zangara, while Mr. Roosevelt was still the president-elect. He was riding in an open car with Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago. Joseph Zangara, as I recall, was standing only a few feet from the president's car when he fired at the president-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt. A woman in the crowd tried to knock Zangara's arm up, but she was unable to throw his aim off entirely. The bullet that was intended for President-elect Roosevelt hit instead Mayor Cermak of Chicago. Mayor Cermak lingered on for almost 2 months before he finally died in the hospital. And his words after being shot were, "I'm glad it was me and not you, Mr. President." Now for a further word from overseas, let's switch to Wells, Hangen, and Bone.
The American Forces Radio Network in Germany is appealing to listeners today not to telephone its switchboards because they are urgently needed for major command communications. That's a direct quotation. The character of the communications is not specified. An American embassy spokesman here denies that the 250,000-man American garrison in Berlin and Germany has been put on alert following Mr. Kennedy's assassination. But reports of at least a command alert persist. West German armed forces were ordered into alert condition number 1, the next thing to all-out mobilization last night. Bonn fears the Russians or East German communists might try to take advantage of the assassination crisis to harass Berlin or put new pressure on West Germany. Wells Hangen, NBC News, Bonn.
In other information here, we've had a proclamation by Lyndon Johnson, his first since assuming the presidency. He has declared Monday a day of mourning throughout the United States, and in a quote from the proclamation he says, "I earnestly recommend the people to assemble on that day in their respective places of divine worship, there to bow down in submission to the will of Almighty God, and to pay their homage of love and reverence to the memory of a great and good man. I invite the people of the world who share our grief to join us in this day of mourning and rededication." The other news is that various dignitaries, chiefs of state, will be arriving in Washington beginning tomorrow to participate in the funeral services for the late president. French President de Gaulle will fly in from Paris along with his foreign minister, Couve de Merville. The deputy prime minister of the Soviet Union, Anastas Mikoyan, will also be arriving here to represent the Soviet Union in the funeral services. Among the other chiefs of state and foreign dignitaries, Prince Philip of Great Britain, who will be representing Queen Elizabeth, the British Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, the President of Ireland, the Prime Minister of Cambodia, Norodom Kanto, from West Germany, the new Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, and the Mayor of Berlin, Willy Brandt. The Prime Minister of Korea, Kim Yun-chu, will also be here for the funeral services. General Tran Van Don, the defense minister, a member of the military junta that toppled the Diem government just a short time ago, will be representing South Vietnam. The foreign minister of Ecuador will also be here.
We have another sad note to inject here. A dispatch has just come from Hollywood that Aldous Huxley, the philosophic novelist, if that's a proper way to describe him, has died at the age of 69. Private funeral services were held this morning in Los Angeles. In connection with the Dallas report that there seems to be no doubt that whoever shot President Kennedy was indeed aiming at the president, Some doubt on that score had earlier been raised because a letter was found in the files of the Pentagon addressed to the now Governor of Texas, John Connally. The letter went to Connally apparently under the misapprehension that Connally was still Secretary of the Navy, although, judging from the reports, he had then left the job. In any event, the letter was from Oswald, who is being held on charges of having murdered the president. And Oswald asked that his discharge from the Marine Corps, which is officially listed as undesirable, I understand, but which Oswald himself called dishonorable, the letter asked that this discharge decision be reversed, that he be given an honorable discharge. Connally replied to the letter that he was no longer Secretary of the Navy and said the letter had been referred to the office of the Secretary, then held by the subsequent Secretary of State, Fred Korth, who is shortly to resign, or who has already resigned. He submitted his resignation. And the letter went through the normal channels, finally reached the proper Marine Corps Board of Appeals, a Marine Review Board, but the board sustained the undesirable discharge. In any event, the fact that the letter was addressed to Connally presumably might have given rise on Oswald's part to an antagonism against Connally on the grounds that he hadn't done what he could have or should have to have his discharge decision changed. And Jim Hurlbut, have you got anything to add at the moment? I've got to catch up with some.
Yes, I have, Bob. In fact, Bob, I have a dispatch from Dallas on the subject of Lee Harvey Oswald. It says that he has refused to take a lie detector test. In quotes, "I don't have to take it, and I don't want to," he said. You know, you were talking about the death of Aldous Huxley, and while the nation is mourning the death of President Kennedy, we have another very tragic story, a story that would command national headlines at any other time but this. This is a story from Norwalk, Ohio, where 65 elderly men and women perished in a rural rest home fire today, in the worst fire in this country since 95 persons, 92 children, and 3 nuns died in the Our Lady of Angels school fire in 1958 in Chicago. Norwalk State Fire Marshal Fred Wright said there were 86 residents and 3 employees in the Golden Age nursing home 10 miles from Norwalk, and in his words, 65 didn't get out. Rice, after an on-the-spot inspection with Governor James Rhodes, confirmed that 3 employees and only 21 of the elderly residents, many of them invalids, escaped from the one-story building, which quickly became an inferno as winds whipped through the structure. This tragedy, though, in Norwalk is far from the worst in the history of Ohio. 3 fires there have each claimed more than 100 lives. The worst of them all was the one back on April 21st in 1930, when a fire in the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus killed 320 prisoners. But Governor Rhodes, as he viewed the ruins of the Golden Age nursing home in Norwalk, said, "This is the most distressing thing I have ever seen." He ordered all assistance that the state's command made available. Then, after that, Governor Rhodes flew to Washington to join other officials in paying their respects to the slain president this afternoon. And Governor Rhodes of Ohio, along with governors of many other states, will go to the East Room of the White House very shortly now this afternoon, when governors of the states and senators and representatives will go to the White House to view the president. And now we have, I think, further word on the developments in Dallas, and for a report on that, we switch to Tom Pettit in Dallas.
Here at Dallas Police Headquarters, Lee Oswald still is in jail, still apparently maintaining his innocence in the killing of President Kennedy. The job now is the questioning of witnesses and the pursuing of other information. A man named Joe Rodriguez Molina is being questioned. He was a fellow employee of Oswald. Apparently, so far, there is nothing to link him to Oswald, other than the fact that he is listed on the Dallas Police list of subversives. Oswald, we are told, has refused to take a lie detector test, saying he didn't think he needed to take it. Chief Curry of the Dallas Police Department has made an appearance here to deny earlier stories that the FBI had some information on Oswald earlier and had him under surveillance. The chief now says he doesn't know whether that's true or not, but he wants to deny that he's accusing the FBI of not cooperating. He says the FBI, the Secret Service, the Texas Rangers, and the Dallas Police Force all are cooperating in the job now of digging up evidence and new information. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, reporting from Dallas Police Headquarters.
Well, Robert McCormick in Washington, I know you heard that report, too, from Tom Pettit down in Dallas. Let's switch back to Robert McCormick in Washington.
I was a little puzzled by the report when it first came in because generally the cooperation between the FBI and the Secret Service and the local police on matters of that sort is most thorough and complete. Obviously, there's too much at stake to be petty about such a thing. If there had been a lack of communications, I'm sure it would have been physical rather than spiritual, so to speak. It would have been an accident, but it would have been a most unlikely accident, even so. When an area is to be canvassed before a president comes into it, all units involved work very, very closely together, and they exchange information readily. As a matter of fact, sometimes they exchange information that to most of us would seem trivial, highly inconsequential. So it would have been most remarkable if the FBI, or for that matter anyone else, had even the faintest suspicion that someone should be watched and had failed to pass that information on.
I've just been informed that we have important new developments now in Dallas, and for that story, let's switch to Tom Pettit in Dallas.
Dallas Police Headquarters is District Attorney Henry Wade, whose job it will be to prosecute Lee Oswald, the man accused of killing President Kennedy. He also is a longtime and close friend of Texas Governor John Connally, who was wounded, of course, in the bullet attack on Friday. Mr. District Attorney, do you feel that you now have enough evidence to successfully prosecute Oswald?
I think we have sufficient evidence at present to prove that he was the one that killed the president.
What is the most telling of that evidence?
I don't want to go into all of the evidence here because we have to pick a jury that's going to try him, and I am refraining from going into any of the evidence that we have.
Suffice it to say that you now feel you have adequate evidence?
Yes, I feel we have sufficient evidence at present. Of course, we want more. The more we have, the better off we are. But if we had to go on just what we got, we have sufficient.
What legal steps now lie ahead before Oswald can be brought to trial?
Under Texas law, the defendant's charged in the Justice Court. Then the next proceedings is the grand jury. Everyone's tried in Texas on an indictment, which only a grand jury can return. Defendant's entitled to an examining trial or a hearing, a writ of habeas corpus hearing on whether or not he can justly be held without bail. Texas law allows people the only people that can be denied bail under the Texas law is a person who will likely get the death penalty. And he can have a hearing, either examining trial or a hearing before a district judge on a writ of habeas corpus, see whether remanding him without bail was proper in this case.
And this, of course, is virtually unique in Texas as compared to other states, is it not? The procedures involved?
Well, I'm more familiar with the ones here than in other states. This is a state district court.
What is the earliest you think he could be brought to trial?
Well, it'll be presented to the grand jury either Wednesday of next week or Monday, December the 2nd, one of those 2 days. It'll be set for trial within about 2 weeks thereafter. The defendant is entitled usually to 1 or 2 continuances if he asks for them. I figure that he will likely be tried around the middle of January.
Do you think you can find an unbiased jury in Dallas, Texas?
We hope we can find a jury that'll be fair to the defendant and fair to us.
And will you ask death in the electric chair for Lee Oswald?
Yes, sir.
That was District Attorney Henry Wade, District Attorney of Dallas County. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, reporting from Dallas Police Headquarters.
Thank you very much, Tom Pettit. While we've been reporting here, my colleague Russ Ward has been checking on new developments around the world, checking on the summary of events up to this time. Here is Russ Ward.
Thank you, Jim. Much of my checking has been in a coffee shop across the street getting a bite of lunch. I might add that at all the tables, people were talking about this tragedy. Groups of people discussing where they were, what they were doing when they first heard of the news. I might also mention that I tried to buy a newspaper at the coffee shop and was told they were sold out, that they had been for some time, at which point a waitress came over and said, "I happen to have a copy of a paper if you'd like to see it, but you have to promise to give it back to me." So she allowed me to read her newspaper, apologizing that it wasn't a New York Times, but let me read it anyhow, which I did, and returned the paper to her. I assume she passed it on to another customer who was unable to find the paper anywhere. Just an indication of the thirst for news that people have, both the written media and what they are receiving currently on our continuous coverage on radio and television.
The latest information we have is that the Dallas City Police say they have a photograph of Oswald holding a rifle with a telescopic sight. The rifle resembles the weapon used to assassinate President John F. Kennedy. We don't know if it can be determined if this is the same rifle that was found in the warehouse where the assassin shot the fatal bullets into the president. But they do have a photograph, they tell us, that shows Oswald holding a rifle as though aiming at something. When the picture was made, we don't know, but that is the latest information from the Dallas Police Department.
Tom, we assume that this was that cinching piece of evidence that was spoken of earlier today. Do you have any indication that there is still further evidence that might come to light during the next few hours?
Yes, I believe that the state will have more information than this, much of which will not be revealed until the trial, which, as you probably know, will be coming up in either late December or early January, possibly a little earlier. We believe they have information and evidence that will be brought up only when the trial begins.
Can you tell us, Tom, if an arraignment date has been set? Or an indictment, that is?
I believe that Oswald will be taken before the grand jury next week. We don't want to do this as hurriedly as they can understand, and next week, probably sometime, he will be taken before the grand jury.
We don't have a specific date on that, I imagine.
Not yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Tom. I hope we'll be in touch with you as these developments unfold your way. I'm sure we'll be back to you before the evening is out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russ.
Again, we repeat, the late John F. Kennedy to receive a hero's burial Monday at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington. A burial to be followed by a solemn pontifical requiem mass at noon on Monday. The White House announced this late today. The family of the slain chief executive had decided on interment in the military cemetery just across the Potomac. Only one other president, William Howard Taft, is buried in Arlington. Ron, let me ask you one question here. It's our understanding that the exact spot of the final resting place has not yet been determined. Am I correct in that belief?
That's what the Arlington Cemetery has just told us. But as I said, Attorney General Kennedy was there this afternoon looking at a spot, and servicemen were seen to be pacing off the ground and to be putting in stakes, and it's assumed that this is the spot where John Kennedy will be laid to rest. This is just about 75 paces down a hill from the Custis Lee Mansion, and this is a familiar landmark to millions of tourists who come to Washington and visit Arlington Cemetery. It was at one time a center of Washington and Virginia society. It was built by a grandson by marriage and adoption of George Washington. This grandson's name was George Washington Parke Custis, and he married a daughter he was related to Robert E. Lee. His son was Robert E. Lee.
And this estate then was owned by Robert E. Lee, and when the Civil War came along, it was confiscated, and it was then turned into a national cemetery. And the place that Attorney General Kennedy and Defense Secretary McNamara and General Taylor were looking at this afternoon is just below this famous mansion.
I'm sure the thousands of worshipers and persons traveling to Washington on Monday to pay respects to the President will see this mansion you're talking about. It's a gorgeous landmark, which is in full view as they drive across the famed Memorial Bridge. They're crossing the Potomac.
President Kennedy, as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, is, of course, entitled to a burial place in Arlington. He is also entitled, as a Navy veteran of World War II. Any veteran is entitled to be buried in Arlington, as are his wife and children.
Ron, we thank you for this information, and we'll be in touch with you momentarily on any further developing angles to the story. I might mention now that the 89-year-old former President Herbert Hoover has announced here in New York that due to a recent illness, he will not be able to journey to Washington on Monday to pay his respects to the President. The spokesman said the former President will be represented by his 60-year-old son, Herbert Jr., who had served as Undersecretary of State for 3 years during the Eisenhower administration. We had received a report earlier in the day that former President Truman would not be able to make it. That, of course, proved to be erroneous because Mr. Truman is in Washington this evening and has been there for several hours. The International Longshoremen's Association has asked its members not to report for work on Monday in observance of the National Day of Mourning that has been proclaimed by President Johnson. ILA President Thomas Gleason, in a statement released in Washington, also expressed the AFL-CIO union's grief over the tragic assassination of the great president. Safeway stores throughout the United States will be closed on Monday during the hours of President Kennedy's funeral. Leaders of a scheduled march for racial equality in St. Louis tomorrow say the demonstration will be a memorial to the assassinated president. A statement from the heads of the city's Conference on Religion and Race says the decision to make the procession of about 20,000 persons a memorial to the late president was reached last night. We will add this note for the hundreds and thousands of persons who are flying the American flag on this unhappy occasion. The display of the flag by civilians in mourning for President Kennedy is provided for in a code adopted in 1924 by veterans and other organizations. The procedure is not covered by federal statute, but in general is similar to that is used by the military. The flag first is run up to the top or to the end of the pole, and then lowered to the traditional half-staff position. And when it is taken off at the end of the day, the flag is again run up to the top and then lowered for removal.
For those local stations that might have some local news or public service announcements of local importance, we will provide stations with approximately 4 minutes for this purpose at 5 minutes before the hour and half hour. The network will, however, continue coverage during this period. The following is the cutaway cue. You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
We'll rejoin NBC for their nationwide coverage from our WLW Communications Exchange at this time. Local and regional news of interest. Xavier University in Cincinnati will hold classes Monday morning, concluding with a noon mass. There will be no classes in the afternoon at Xavier University. Classes at the University of Cincinnati for Monday have been canceled. Also, Our Lady of Cincinnati College will be closed Monday, and Miami University of Ohio will have classes on an abbreviated schedule. A 30-day mourning period has been proclaimed in Indiana by Governor Welsh in tribute to President Kennedy. Hoosier schools will be closed at the discretion of the local school authorities in compliance with a request by Governor Welsh. Governor Burt Combs tonight proclaimed Monday an official day of mourning for the state of Kentucky and urged Kentuckians to assemble in their respective places of worship for memorial services to the late President Kennedy. from his offices at the state capitol, Governor Combs further urged all places of commerce in Kentucky either to close for the day or at least for a sufficient time to allow every Kentuckian to attend a memorial service in his place of worship. The governor also requested school administrators to take appropriate action to close all public schools for the day. Our WLW Communications Exchange has been told that all schools in the Cincinnati area, including those in northern Kentucky, public, private, and parochial, will be closed on Monday, as will all schools in Hamilton County, Ohio, be closed. And also, the Milford schools and the public offices in Claremont County, Ohio, will be closed. Governor Burt Combs will leave Frankfort tomorrow night and fly to Washington to attend funeral services for the late president. Flying with Combs in his private plane will be Lieutenant Governor Wilson Wyatt and Governor-elect Edward Breathitt. All post office facilities will be closed Monday because of the death of the president. Post office installations will operate on a holiday basis by order of the Postmaster General at Washington, D.C. No deliveries will be made. All employees required to be on duty during the holiday will be given time off from noon to 1 p.m. during the funeral service period. The annual Ohio State University Football Appreciation Banquet scheduled for Monday night has been postponed until further notice. Now, all 5 of today's football games involving Big Ten teams were canceled, but 3 were rescheduled for later dates. Illinois and Michigan State will have their showdown on Thanksgiving Day, while Wisconsin and Minnesota also play their rescheduled game that day. Purdue will meet Indiana, and Ohio State will play Michigan on November 30th. The game between Notre Dame and Iowa has been canceled because Notre Dame plays Syracuse on Thanksgiving Day. For the regional weather, from our WLW Radar Weather Service, meteorologist Frank Pierce. Frank?
Good evening, everyone. Well, checking the weather now and the progress as the cold air moves to the eastern seaboard. The leading edge is now off of the coastal areas there, or just moving off the coastal areas, and the rains around Washington have once again let up. Most of them are now over. The wind is around to the northwest now, and the temperature has dropped down to 56 degrees. So as we see it now, with the amount of cool air moving into the picture, it'll be gliding across the southern side of our area during the day Sunday. It'll be over in the Virginias as far as come Monday, and that should give a rather bright day for the sad ceremonies that'll be going on in the Washington area on Monday. We'll look for generally fair skies there and temperatures warming up a little bit over what we'll find there tomorrow, which will be much like we're having around here. Back here we are in the 30s, and some of the areas now falling below freezing, such as downtown Cincinnati with 31 and 29 degrees in clear skies in Indiana, at Indianapolis, and 32 at Richmond, 33 at Dayton, Ohio, and Columbus is 36. And the trailing edge of the cloud band is moving into our western regions now. The WLW weather forecast is for the clearing trend to continue on through the night tonight, with some flurries over on the eastern side, or eastern counties of Ohio, no accumulations of snow, and finally into a clear picture tomorrow morning with temperatures in the 20s mostly, about 24 in Cincinnati. During the day on Sunday then, still on the windy side from the west and northwest, the temperatures under partly cloudy skies, or partly sunny skies if you will, generally in the 30s, around 35 to 37 in Cincinnati. It's 31 now, and that's the weather.
And now this is Jim Bollinger at WLW in Cincinnati, returning you for the nationwide coverage to NBC.
Oswald will be transferred to the county jail at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was thought he might be transferred tonight, but late word from police headquarters indicates he'll be taken over to the county jail, just literally feet away from where the assassination took place, at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Tom, when Oswald was seized at the theater there, we got reports of this large crowd of people shouting, "Lynch him." Am I correct in that?
There were similar statements. There was a photographer quoted as saying something along that line, like, "I hope you burn," or something along that line. I don't believe there was any connection to the assassination at the time. Oswald, when arrested at the theater, is alleged to have pulled a pistol. He was unable to fire on officers who arrested him, after running 4 or 5 blocks after allegedly killing the policeman about 4 or 5 blocks from the theater. There was a woman and a photographer quoted in dispatches that made statements similar to those you described.
Have there been any other outbursts of public indignation directed specifically toward this man since that initial arrest?
Well, public officials and anyone involved in it have certainly expressed sorrow and not exactly madness at this person. They call him a maniac and a nut, but as far as any public gathering in the streets, something along that line, a lynch mob, no.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Persons gathering outside the quarters where he's being held.
No, there were several hundred people waiting this afternoon for his transfer to the county jail. But as we say, he won't be transferred there. I suppose 1,000, 2,000 persons were lining ropes and barricades set up by police near the county jail, along with 50 or 60 reporters waiting to take his picture if he appeared. But he won't be, and the people, I suppose, have dispersed by now, or most of them have.
We understand Oswald lost some of what was described earlier as his arrogant air after he had seen the photographs of himself with the rifle that is being held. Do you have any further enlightenment on that?
Yes, he made a statement over in Police Captain Will Fritz's office to the effect that he wanted a lawyer. He was seeking the lawyer from New York, Mr. Apt, who has represented people with communistic backgrounds, and he appeared to have calmed down some.
Tom, we thank you for this report from Dallas, and we'll be in touch with you throughout the evening.
Right.
We go immediately back to Dallas now, and the police chief there with further details on this murder weapon.
Chief Curry, I understand you have some new information in this case. Could you relate what that is?
Yes, we've just been informed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation that they, the FBI, have the order letter from a mail order house, and this the order was sent to their laboratory in Washington, and the writing on this order was compared with known samples of our suspect Oswald's handwriting and found to be the same.
This order was for the rifle?
This order was for the rifle to a mail order house in Chicago. It was, the return address was to Dallas, Texas, to the post office box under the name of A. Hidell, H-I-D-E-double-L. This is the post office box of our suspect. This gun was mailed parcel post on March the 20th, 1963. I understand he left Dallas shortly after this and didn't come back until, I think, about 2 months ago.
Do you know, again, on what date this rifle was ordered, and are you able to link it definitely as the rifle which you confiscated at the school book depository?
That we have not done so far. If the FBI has been able to do it, I have not been informed of it yet. We do know that this man ordered a rifle of the type that was used in the assassination of the president from this mail order house in Chicago, and the FBI has definitely identified the writing as that of our suspect.
On another subject, I understand you have photographs of the suspect Oswald with a rifle like that used. Could you describe that picture?
Well, this is a picture of Oswald standing facing a camera with a rifle in his hand, which is very similar to the rifle that we have in our possession. He also had a pistol strapped on his hip. He was holding two papers in his hand, which one of them seemed to be the worker. The other says be militant, or I don't know whether that was headlines or the name of the paper.
How much did the gun cost from the mail order house?
I understand the gun was advertised for $12.78, I believe.
Have you received any results on the ballistics test conducted on the gun and on Oswald?
They're going to be favorable. I don't have a formal report yet.
But you are sure at this time they will be favorable?
Yes.
Do you feel now that you have the case completely wrapped up, or are you continuing?
We will continue as long as there's a shred of evidence to be gathered. We have a strong case at this time.
I believe you said early this afternoon that you have a new development which does wrap up the case. The first time you said the case definitely is secure. Is that correct?
That was this morning. This additional evidence just makes a stronger case.
But this is not the same evidence you're referring to then?
No, that's true.
Will you be willing to say what that evidence was?
No, sir, I don't wish to reveal it. It might jeopardize our case.
Thank you very much. Chief Jesse Curry of the Dallas Police Department.
We continue now with our coverage on this period, 31 hours and 30 minutes following the death of John F. Kennedy. And we go first to NBC's John Lavacek for reaction from Miami.
Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro is now speaking over Havana radio and talking about the death of President Kennedy. Fidel has lamented the fact that the assassination took place. He said that while both President Kennedy and President Eisenhower were hostile to the Cuban Revolution, nevertheless, an act of assassination is grave and bad. Castro opened his speech with a review of the actions of the Kennedy administration during the Bay of Pigs invasion. He has said that Kennedy's death will have great repercussions upon the rest of Latin America. Castro was an hour late in beginning his speech, which is now being broadcast over Havana television and radio stations and being monitored here in Miami. He continues to speak. This is John Lavacek, NBC News in Miami.
Thank you, John, for that report. We get further reaction now as we go to various capitals around the world on reaction to the death of the president. Let's hear from NBC's John Chancellor in Berlin.
From our vantage point here in West Berlin, several important themes of communist reaction emerged today in connection with the death of the president. The point of most immediate importance to the people of the United States is that the Cold War apparently is not going to turn hot overnight because John F. Kennedy is gone and Lyndon Johnson has taken his place. There are several reasons for this. One is the great length to which Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union has gone to demonstrate his sorrow and shock over the death of the president. He was echoed in these sentiments by the highest range of Soviet officials, including an influential and unofficial personality, Mrs. Khrushchev. Premier Khrushchev went beyond telegraphing his condolences. Moscow let it be known that he returned today, especially from an out-of-town trip, so that he could call on the American ambassador in Moscow for a personal demonstration of his feelings. On top of that, the Soviets are sending First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan to President Kennedy's funeral. Mikoyan serves a double purpose. He is an old and canny Armenian negotiator who has always got along well with Americans, and he is a man of exalted rank in the Soviet hierarchy. Moreover, the governmental leaders of the East Bloc satellites and their propaganda organizations have been relatively profuse in their messages of condolence and their reporting of the president's death. This applies to some very tough characters in the communist world, including Antonin Novotny of Czechoslovakia and Walter Ulbricht of East Germany. Both have sent messages to Washington, and the leading newspaper in East Germany, Neues Deutschland, turned over a remarkably large portion of its front page today to the Kennedy story. In Moscow, the Russians have borrowed film of Mr. Kennedy from the American Embassy vaults, and a special obituary program on the late president is now being prepared for Moscow television. Among other important things to recall, however, about the communist position is the fact, which must be exceedingly uncomfortable to the communists, is the fact that the man accused of murdering Mr. Kennedy has described himself as a Marxist and, according to one report, as a communist. Furthermore, the man has lived in the Soviet Union and married a Russian girl. This poses a propaganda hurdle of gigantic magnitude for the communists, who were quick off the mark to charge that the president had been killed by a right-wing American racist. So far, the communists have not tried to get over the hurdle, and no one in the Soviet Union, for example, has been told these details about Lee Harvey Oswald. But the voice of America is no longer jammed in Russia, and the people of that country are bound to get the word one way or another. So the Russians there have a bad problem. Finally, in their eulogies to the president, the universal communist line is that the world has lost a man who was working toward a relaxation of international tension. And of course, so he was. But by this tactic, the communists are making it possible to say, look, we got along with President Kennedy, and we said so, but we can't get along with President Johnson. The Russians can say that if they want to. We don't know if they will or not. All we can say now is that on the basis of the evidence here tonight, the Cold War will not get a lot hotter tomorrow. John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
We have more reaction to the death of the president now as we hear from Charles Morgan in San Francisco.
This was a year in which San Francisco merchants had hoped to rush the Christmas season a week, inaugurating it today. Well, there was no festive air here. It was only gloom, physical gloom, which joined in the weeping of San Franciscans. The skies cried all day. Emotional gloom which naturally gripped everyone. Department store windows throughout the city were unlighted. All displays were removed from the windows of I. Magnum, the leading high-fashion store. In each was a pillar topped with a vase of American Beauty roses. One window of the White House department store contained a huge scroll containing the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." The NBC correspondent watched several men and women break up and incidentally joined them. In the window of a fashionable men's store, there was a Catholic missal open to the pages containing the Requiem Mass, a rosary draped across it. Each Christmas season, the City of Paris department store mounts in its main rotunda a huge tree resplendent with decorations and lights. The lights were dark today, as if in embarrassment at the gaudy display. The Temple Bar, one of the city's most prominent and swinging watering places, was closed tight last night. Its doors bear today wreaths of mourning. The popular restaurants in Maiden Lane will close on Monday, as will restaurants throughout the city. Most noticeable in downtown San Francisco was the absence of children whom fond parents had hoped to bring to Santa Claus, and the few Santa Clauses on hand didn't have their hearts in their work. The wet, chilly streets of San Francisco are poetically reflective of the mood of gloom which permeates this city. Charles Morgan, NBC News, San Francisco.
That reaction from the West Coast on the death of former President Kennedy, the reaction there and around the country has been one of profound grief. It certainly was evidenced on this Saturday afternoon, a day of traditional collegiate sports and other festive activities, but today less than 1/4 of about 50 major college football games that had been scheduled took place. Only Pimlico, of the 5 thoroughbred racing tracks operating, conducted its meeting. All 3 harness racing tracks were closed in the New York area. 2 of the 4 National Association basketball games scheduled for tonight were postponed. A National Hockey League game in Toronto was to go on, but one of the 3 games scheduled for Sunday night was called off. The Cajun Golf Classic at Lafayette, Louisiana, postponed its 3rd round until Sunday, when the 36 holes of play will be completed in that tournament. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's 2 small children were told last night that their father was dead. It is not known what words were used to make them understand, nor who performed the task. It is to be assumed that it was their mother, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, who was close beside her husband from the moment he was killed by that assassin's bullet until he returned home to the White House for the last time during the early hours of this morning. His body now lying in the East Room of the Executive Mansion. Mrs. Kennedy spent most of the night at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the slain president had been taken from Andrews Air Force Base when it arrived in the capital city. She rode in that ambulance with the body and remained at the hospital from 7 o'clock last night until 4 o'clock this morning. Her children were taken from the White House to the nearby home of Mrs. Hugh Auchincloss, their maternal grandmother, late yesterday afternoon. Following dinner in the Auchincloss residence, Caroline and John Jr. returned to the White House private quarters. They went upstairs about 7:30 with their nurse, Maud Shaw, who has been with the Kennedys since Caroline was just 11 days old. John Jr. to be 3 years old on Monday. His father's funeral to take place that day as the whole nation observes a day of national mourning. For more reaction from around the nation now, we hear from Bill Woods, station KENO in Las Vegas.
Las Vegas, America's entertainment capital and a city not generally noted for compassionate demonstrations, was dark last night night for the first time in the memory of many local reporters. Showrooms in the spectacular casino hotels were shut down shortly after the news of the assassination of the president was announced. Old hands on the Vegas scene were actually shocked to see the marquees along the famous strip go dark, as it is often said that nothing short of an A-bomb could stop the 24-hour entertainment and lavish shows designed to lure gamblers into Nevada casinos. The shows were canceled, but gambling went on as usual last night. First reports indicate that casino business was only off slightly. Las Vegas entertainment is back in full swing tonight. However, along with all gambling casinos, will be closed during President Kennedy's funeral on Monday. Bill Wood Jr., NBC, Las Vegas.
I wonder if Ed Newman is with us in our Washington studios now.
I am, Russ. I was thinking about what we were talking about before, the comment of the Times of London tomorrow, the Sunday Times of London, which is, of course, already on the streets, that Mr. Johnson was one of the most egocentric men in public life, and you remember we discussed that and thought it was somewhat overstated. I thought as I reflected on it that perhaps the great difference between Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Johnson in that respect is that Mr. Johnson appears to lack the sense of humor about himself as a politician that Mr. Kennedy had, and I have put that point to a really old hand here in Washington who knows far more about it than I do, Robert McCormick. Is that true?
Well, I'd never thought of it actually in those terms, but I think you probably are right now that you bring it up. Of course, the thing that most of us have noticed in Johnson since he became Senate leader, which goes back a good ways, is his perfectly fantastic temper. He's liable to explode like an A-bomb without any warning at all, and when he does, well, we might just as well know the sort of man we have in the White House, sort of man he's been at least. He can be downright rude. I've been at news conferences when female reporters in the back of the room have said very quietly and politely, please, Mr. Johnson, could you speak a little louder? And he said, no, I won't speak any louder. If you can't hear me, you'll have to get a fill-in from somebody else. Well, that obviously is something that happens under stress, but at the same time, his temper is almost legendary. He is not deliberately unpleasant. As a matter of fact, when you're with him in a living room or in any sort of a social gathering, he's a garrulous person. He loves to talk and tell stories. He's extremely amusing and awfully well informed. He's, I don't know whether he has quite the almost photographic memory that the late President Kennedy had for figures and facts, but he's simply stuffed with information about anything he attempts to go into. If he doesn't know, this, mind you, is all past experience, if he doesn't know anything about a subject, he doesn't attempt to declare himself on it. In other words, he wants to know the facts before he, as we say in the colloquial, shoots off his mouth, and he's never, to my knowledge at least, varied from that, which is one reason he was so successful as a Senate leader, because whether he was being rough with other senators or whether he was being friendly with a well-known gesture of putting his arm around the recalcitrant's shoulder, he backed up his arguments always with positive and solid information.
Bob, you mentioned Mr. Johnson's temper. You said he had a tremendous and legendary temper. So, of course, does Mr. Eisenhower. Is that not so?
Oh, absolutely. President Eisenhower's temper was one that was better concealed, I think. I don't mean to imply he had better control of it. Perhaps it was just that he never really let go with it where it might damage not his own image, but damage the job he held. And he had that much control of it. But people who have worked with President Eisenhower very closely, of course, have been sort of terrified sometimes by his temper.
Well, the people who work with Mr. Johnson, who have worked with Mr. Johnson, in spite of his temper, have been very devoted to him and very, very happy to work with him, have they not, and for him?
He works his staff very, very hard. I don't think there's a harder taskmaster in Washington, but those of his staff that I've had the pleasure and privilege of knowing are completely devoted to him, and the turnover in his staff has been very small. He has people who have been with him and around him for many, many years, and they are just, I guess devoted is the only word. They admire him a great deal. They will hear nothing bad about him. They are quite aware of his temper and other sort of little personal foibles that heaven knows we all have. But those things apparently are completely counterbalanced by qualities in the man that aren't quite so obvious as a display of temper which is triggered by something just at the moment. But he is, I go back again, he's an extremely charming person to be around. And when he comes to a party and decides to talk, he's just bewitching. He thinks in colorful terms. He has a very penetrating mind. He can sort of go to the, particularly in politics, he can go to the point of anything with great decision and forthrightness.
Robert, allow me to interrupt for just a moment and refer back to this announcement by Pierre Salinger that Lyndon Johnson wants the former president's cabinet to stay on the job. Would you care to comment on how that might be translated in terms of the future of the president's brother, the Attorney General?
The question, Bob, is since President Johnson has asked the cabinet to remain on the job, what is likely to be the future of Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General?
Well, obviously, I don't think any of us has any information. My own guess would be that the Attorney General will himself want to get out, quite without regard to what the President might want him to do, because he probably will feel that he just wouldn't fit in, and I don't know, it just seems to me that psychologically he would want to get out and sort of strike off on his own, but that's just a wild guess. Maybe the President, if he wants him enough to remain, will be able to persuade him to do so.
I have seen tonight, Russ, the first suggestion that Robert Kennedy might go on a ticket with Mr. Johnson as the vice presidential candidate in 1964. Now, obviously, there's nothing more behind this than the merest sort of speculation on the part of the man who wrote the article. But it is something we might conceivably hear more about in the future.
If we judge by standard politics, perhaps a more logical selection would be Hubert Humphrey, the Senate Democratic whip, because, again, assessing the political situation by the traditional standards, Lyndon Johnson will have a great appeal in rural areas and more appeal in the South than the late President Kennedy would have had. But he will have two weak points, one in the industrial areas of the East and the other in the so-called mountain states out through the near West, if we can call it that, Montana and Idaho and Wyoming, and Minnesota. And in those areas, of course, Humphrey would be extremely strong, presumably, again, judging by traditional political standards.
Robert,
where the Attorney General's political power would be is a little bit hard to tell.
The other important developing center of this story is Dallas, Texas, where the assassination took place about 34 hours ago. Dallas police are saying they believe they have cinched their case against the assassin of the late President Kennedy. For more on the Dallas story, we go to Tom Perryman.
Russ, the latest developments in Dallas includes these points. Accused assassin Oswald remains adamant, denying any knowledge of the assassination of John Kennedy. A paraffin test taken to determine if Oswald had fired a weapon appears positive, says police. Police say they have a photo of Oswald aiming a rifle with a telescopic sight made at his home in Irving, near Dallas. Oswald was seeking this evening the services of lawyer John Apt of New York City. The accused assassin will be transferred to the county jail from the city jail tomorrow morning at 10. And a fund has been started for the widow and 3 children of the late patrolman J.D. Tippett. A Victoria industrial worker started the fund for the widow and 3 children today. And Charles D. Griffith is identified as the man from Victoria down in South Texas. And we talked with police headquarters. The chief had already gone home this evening when we were checking on this matter, but money has received at the Dallas Police Department in hopes of providing adequate income for the widow of the late J.D. Tippett. We understand she will not be eligible for a pension, and money has been arriving at the Dallas Police Chief's office. That's the latest developments from Dallas.
This is NBC Radio, News on the Hour. Now here is Russ Ward, NBC News.
Cuban Premier Fidel Castro expressed doubt tonight that Lee Oswald, accused slayer of President Kennedy, is a leader of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in the United States. Castro also said his regime had no connection with the president's death. He charged that the, quote, most reactionary elements in the United States are trying to link Cuba with Oswald and with the assassination. In Dallas, Texas, police say they have an airtight case against Oswald. Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry says he has old photographs that show Oswald carrying an Italian-made rifle similar to that used to kill the president. The pictures were found in Irving, Texas, the residence of Oswald's Russian-born wife. Police and FBI agents have a letter Oswald used to order a bolt-action rifle from a Chicago mail-order house. Earlier, police announced that tests of Oswald's hands proved he had recently fired a weapon. Oswald still says he is innocent and has confessed to nothing. Later today, police formally accused Oswald of attempted murder in the wounding of Texas Governor John Conley, who remains in satisfactory condition in a Dallas hospital. Oswald also is charged with the murder of a Dallas policeman, J.D. Tippett. Meanwhile, in Washington, mourning for the president continues. Mr. Kennedy's body and a flag-draped casket lay in state in the East Room of the White House. A private family mass was said there this morning, and then led by President Lyndon Johnson, the members of the government, state governors, and foreign diplomats came to pay their last respects. President Kennedy will be buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery on Monday after a pontifical requiem mass at noon in St. Matthew's Cathedral. A longtime friend of the Kennedy family, Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston, will officiate. Tomorrow, the president's body will be borne down Pennsylvania Avenue to the rotunda of the Capitol, where it will lie in state until Monday morning. Mrs. Kennedy will ride in a limousine behind the caisson bearing the body of her 46-year-old husband. When the cortege arrives at the Capitol, a battery will fire the traditional 21-gun salute, and the band will play the ruffles and flourishes, followed by the president's march, Hail to the Chief. While at the rotunda, the public will be allowed to view the casket. It will rest on the catafalque used when President Lincoln lay in state almost 100 years ago. At 11 o'clock on Monday, the president's body will be moved to the cathedral for the Requiem Mass and then on to Arlington for burial. As the morning went on in Washington and around the world today, President Johnson took up the reins of government. In one of his first official acts, he proclaimed Monday as a day of national mourning for Mr. Kennedy, whom he called a great and good man. Earlier in the day, President Johnson held a cabinet meeting in which he asked for and got assurances that all 10 members will continue in their positions. Operating from his old suite in the Executive Office Building, President Johnson also held conferences with key members of the former president's administration, including CIA Director John McCone and McGeorge Bundy, presidential advisor on national security affairs. Former Presidents Eisenhower and Truman also called on Mr. Johnson. President Johnson will address a joint session of Congress next Wednesday. Meanwhile, leaders of Congress indicated they will give President Johnson a breathing spell so he can clarify his plans and programs. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield of Montana says the Senate will meet briefly Monday, just long enough to pass a resolution of sympathy over the death of the president. Speaker John McCormick said the House will resume its work briefly on Wednesday to act on urgent money legislation and then will adjourn on Friday. Lady Bird Johnson assumed her role as the First Lady with a quiet dignity. She met with congressional leaders briefly while her husband was in conference with administration officials. Later, Mrs. Kennedy offered Mrs. Johnson all possible help to make the changeover a smooth one. Leaders of foreign governments and their peoples are joining Americans to mourn President Kennedy. In Western Europe, many countries honored the late president with traditions reserved only for the deaths of their own leaders. In England, Queen Elizabeth ordered a week of mourning. French President Charles de Gaulle, preparing to fly here tomorrow for the funeral, ordered the tricolor flown at half-mast. All over West Berlin tonight, candles flicker in thousands of windows in a final tribute to the president.
This is the NBC Radio Network.
This is the Nation Station, WLW in Cincinnati.